You may not think much about the color of cloth, especially not one shade of indigo over another. But in 18th century West Africa, the difference between storm blue and dusk black could quietly alter a marriage, offend a king, or unravel the reputation of an entire weaving family. Tonight, you'll fall gently into the quiet world of thread, dye pits, and whispered color judgments where the only arguments were made not with words, but with fabric. You'll hear how grandmothers passed down recipes in silence, how cloth became tribute, and how a shade too green could stir old rivalries in the marketplace. So settle in. Let the loom creak. Let the dye seep in layers, because this is the boring but true history of how artisans once debated the color blue, and how those arguments still ripple softly through fabric markets to this very day. Chapter 1. Among the indigo pots. You are standing at the edge of a bustling 18th century Sahel market, and there is a smell in the air you do not forget easily. Wood smoke, warm cotton, fermented leaves, and faint ammonia. It is the smell of indigo. Dyeing, a quiet but vital industry tucked into the daily hum of West African life. Here, among rows of calabashes, hand-woven baskets, and gourd ladles, the arguments are not about politics or land. They are about blue. To outsiders, one indigo cloth might look very much like another. But to the trained eye of a West African dyer, especially those in the Hausa city-states, the Mossy Kingdom, or the Yoruba towns further south, a wrong blue could mean social embarrassment, the loss of trade, or even shame brought upon a family lineage. These weren't loud arguments. They unfolded in the flick of a wrist as a swatch was held to sunlight, or the twitch of a nostril when a cloth smelled faintly of poorly aged dye paste. Shade matching was not cosmetic. It was a language. In the mid-1700s, cloth in the Sahel region was not merely clothing. It was currency, archive, offering, and status. Indigo dyeing was one of the most complex, subtle crafts practiced almost entirely by women, a knowledge passed from mother to daughter, a heritage soaked into the skin over decades. Hands and fingernails were often stained deep purple from stirring pots with carved wooden paddles. Dyers sometimes used their forearms to test dye consistency, adjusting pH with ash water or old fermented leaves. The dyeing process itself was deceptively delicate. Indigo is not applied directly in its blue form. Instead, leaves from the indigofera plant were harvested, soaked, fermented, and turned into a paste. This paste, mixed with a base liquid, often urine or water treated with ashes, produced a vat of dye that was greenish-yellow when fresh. Cloth dipped into this liquid would emerge dull and greenish. Only upon exposure to air would it oxidize and turn blue. The more dips and the better the timing, the deeper and more stable the shade. Matching shades, then, became both art and science. A cloth dyed in a cooler vat might result in a sharper blue, while a warmer one could drift toward violet. The age of the dye paste mattered. So did the weather. So did the phase of the moon, according to some traditions. This made replicating a client's desired tone extremely challenging, especially in communities where ceremonial garments had to match family or clan standards. So the arguments began in 1756 in a small market outside Katsina. A woman named Hadiza, herself a fourth-generation dyer, was said to have rejected 3 bolts of cloth made by her sister-in-law because the shade was brassy. Local accounts suggest she held the swatches to her cheek and sniffed them before shaking her head. Her sister-in-law defended her vat chemistry, saying the paste had been aged the proper number of days. The dispute lasted a week. During that time, Hadiza's courtyard vat was covered and untouched. She refused to sell until her own dye matched the original contract. These disagreements rarely ended in violence, but they could alter family ties. In a world where women's economic status and social reputation were closely tied to their skill in managing dye pots, matching a previously sold shade became a matter of pride. Dyers accused of inconsistency could lose long-standing market. stalls, or loyal clients. Sometimes a public reconciliation occurred, in the form of a shared dyeing session or communal meal. Beyond individual artisans, entire towns became associated with particular shades. In Kano, a deep matte blue known as kula was preferred, made possible by the use of locally harvested indigo plants and high-altitude fermentation. Traders from Timbuktu or Gao would request it by name. Meanwhile, other towns specialized in brighter hues or particular folding techniques used to resist dye patterns into the cloth. A technique similar to what would later be called tie-dye. Buyers had expectations. A traveling Tuareg merchant might unroll bolts in the middle of a dusty compound and inspect them like a jeweler examining gemstones. Holding them up to the light, he might demand, "Why does this blue lean toward ash? Was the vat old?" It wasn't rude. It was respect for the craft. In many ways, these dye disputes mirrored larger themes of tradition and transition. As trade routes shifted and foreign goods trickled southward, imported cotton and even synthetic dyes began to enter markets. These new materials were faster, cheaper, and unreliable. The colors faded after a single wash or bled into the skin. But they were tempting. Some young dyers began experimenting quietly. Older women noticed. The arguments returned, but this time they weren't just about matching blue. They were about whether tradition could survive against the creeping convenience of modernity. Still, in 1758, an elder dyer in Zinder reportedly told her granddaughter, "When the moon turns blue, so should the cloth. If it doesn't, you missed something." It wasn't about hue alone. It was about the ritual of observation. The slow certainty that comes from waiting, testing, and dipping again. In the shade of a woven awning, another dyer stirs her vat. Her fingers know the depth by feel. Her cloth, stretched beside her, is almost the same shade as her mother's was 30 years ago. Almost, but not quite. How did these subtle disagreements shape the resilience of a regional identity? And could a color ever really be matched twice in the same way? Chapter 2. Reputation in a shade of blue. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're holding a folded bolt of indigo-dyed cloth against your chest. It smells faintly of ash, fermented leaves, and thyme. The fibers still hold traces of the vat. And in a certain light, the surface ripples with hints of green, purple, or coal black. This cloth isn't merely dyed cotton, it's an argument in pigment, a pledge in color, and a record of promises. In the second part of our story, we step deeper into the silent politics of shade, the ways in which weavers, dyers, traders, and even rulers navigated the indigo labyrinth of reputation. By the mid-18th century, indigo cloth had become a standard medium of exchange in much of West Africa. In regions like the Hausa city-states, Yorubaland, and the Jollof Confederacy, cloth moved in caravans and boats with the same importance as cowries or metal ingots. But unlike currency, each piece of cloth carried a fingerprint, a signature, of its maker's choices, skills, and sometimes their missteps in the town of Abeokuta. In what is now southwestern Nigeria, oral traditions speak of a weaving matriarch whose dyed cloth was so reliably colored that her name became synonymous with a particular shade. Traders would walk into markets asking not for blue, but for Ajik's river cloth, even long after she passed. To maintain this level of recognition, her descendants used guarded recipes for mordants and leaf fermentation, and kept dye vats alive for decades by feeding them regularly with banana stems, goat urine, or ground tamarind bark settle. Tweaks that altered tone just enough to stand apart from competitors. This form of artisanal reputation was fragile. One story from a village near the Niger Bend tells of a young dyer who hurried the drying process during harmattan winds to meet a trader's deadline. The cloth lightened as it oxidized, revealing faint streaks. The trader, unimpressed, refused to take the shipment. The story goes that the young man's family had to repay the value in millet and chickens. and his mother removed his name from the family's dye ledger for 2 seasons. Yes, there were ledgers. Handwritten by clan elders or memorized by heart, these long fading records tracked which families produced which hues for which clients. In a pre-industrial society, the cloth was not mass-produced, it was bespoke. If someone from the Asante kingdom ordered 100 strips of indigo cloth as diplomatic tribute, the order might pass through several hands, and any mistake along the way could cost not only silver, but honor. To reduce such risks, some regions developed cloth cooperatives communal dye pits managed by several families. Here, an elder often served as arbiter in disputes. If cloth was rejected for its tone, the elder might examine both the rejected lot and the ideal sample, measuring under candlelight and asking neutral dyers to give their opinion. In some cases, cloth was re-dyed. In others, it was stripped down and turned into domestic cloth instead of ceremonial wear. Interestingly, men and women played different roles depending on the region. In many Yoruba towns, women dominated dyeing, while men often wove. In the house estates, men were heavily involved in both crafts, especially in urban centers like Kano. But in either case, the politics of shade matching were as complex as any. Court intrigue. Families might accuse rivals of watering down vats, or of mimicking trademark hues too closely. These disputes rarely led to violence, but they could result in long-term feuds, whispered insults at market stalls, or refusals to marry between families. The most prestigious weavers developed protective practices. Some stored finished cloth in smokehouses to deepen tone and discourage mold. Others created visual signatures, woven markers embedded near the edge of the cloth, visible only to trained eyes. This helped identify the origin if disputes arose, after cloth traveled hundreds of miles. In this way, a bolt of fabric became both a textile and a legal document, an insurance policy made of thread and dye. But even with all this care, misunderstandings were common. Not all cloth traveled well. A beautiful deep blue robe made in Gao might arrive faded in Abome after weeks of sun exposure. A wet market day could dampen the finish. To buyers in faraway places, this appeared as negligence. To the makers, it was weather's betrayal. And thus, reputation hung in the balance, sometimes on whether a trader stored the shipment under shade cloth during a 2-day sandstorm. Then there was the problem of substitution. As demand grew, some opportunists began passing off lesser cloths as premium ones. They would darken mediocre bolts with soot rubs or oil rub-downs, making them appear richer. The deceit often worked for a few weeks, but when the cloth began to fade prematurely or stain skin, the buyer would trace it back, sometimes all the way through multiple traders. These were dangerous gains. A market trickster could be fined, expelled, or even punished by town elders. To combat this, trust networks formed. Long-term traders established partnerships with specific families or workshops. These relationships were often cemented with gifts, cola nuts, livestock, even marriage proposals. The cloth exchanged hands, but behind it moved a quieter economy of loyalty. But what happened when a community's color was compromised not by fraud, but by accident, by a failed harvest of indigo leaves, or by war displacing key weavers? This brings us to a story from the mid-1700s, from near the Gambia River, where a local dye pit dried up during a regional conflict. Without access to fresh leaves, the community began using older fermented stock. The resulting dye was weaker, more brittle. The cloths lacked the usual richness, and complaints arrived from as far away as the Fouta Jalan highlands. The dyers, facing shame, made a bold decision. They would let their vats go dormant for a year. No cloth would leave their pit until it reached the proper shade again. That year, they survived by weaving raffia mats instead. In the end, it was a choice to preserve reputation over profit. So we return to the question, What was more valuable in 18th century West African cloth production, speed or shade? Volume or trust? And when the stakes were social and ceremonial, not just economic, how did a single misplaced thread ripple across an entire community? Chapter 3. Shades of Power and the Afterlife of Cloth. Imagine walking through a twilight market in the Sahel, the sun having just slipped below the mud brick rooftops, leaving behind long shadows that stretch across folded bolts of cloth. Indigo dyed. Strips, now softened by the cool evening air, fluttered gently on woven racks. You pass stalls where candles flicker behind clay jars, and elders quietly argue with their eyes, not their voices, over the quality of a bolt's sheen. This is the afterlife of color, where disputes about dye have turned into deeply embedded traditions. By the early 1800s, indigo had come to signify far more than wealth or craft. It was part of political ritual. Chiefs wore cloaks dyed to reflect their rank. Envoys carried indigo-wrapped parcels as part of their tribute, and judges in some communities accepted only cloth of a specific hue as part of legal restitution. A color could quite literally mean the difference between peace and insult. And yet, these layers of meaning remained fragile. In the town of Jen, a disagreement arose not between dyers, but between interpreters. A translator sent to deliver dyed cloth to a Moroccan trader misnamed the color using a poetic term reserved for mourning instead of the proper diplomatic term. The result? The trader, believing he had been insulted with death cloth, refused the entire shipment and returned home empty-handed. The incident was noted in local oral histories as a lesson in the politics of pigment. Even outside formal trade, indigo disputes shaped personal lives. A young bride whose dowry cloth was deemed too green rather than storm blue might be mocked by her in-laws. A mourning robe too deep in hue could be seen as dramatic, even disrespectful. These were not trivial matters. They were emotional codes stitched into everyday life. But in time, deeper changes were underway, the Atlantic trade networks expanding. Through the 18th and early 19th centuries, introduced European indigo processed faster and with chemical precision. These imported blues threatened to undermine generations of labor and identity. While some traders welcomed the consistency of the foreign dye, many weavers resisted. Their cloth, made from local leaves, aged organically. Its imperfection was its authenticity. In towns like Kano and Katsina, local dye pits became sites of protest, not violent resistance, but quiet, persistent loyalty. Some weavers began marking their bolts with tiny, barely visible knots near the hem signatures of authenticity. Others returned to older techniques, refusing to adopt faster fermentation methods. Guilds enforced stricter apprenticeships, requiring young dyers to master local plant harvesting and vat care before they could earn trade privileges. Still, the tide turned. By the mid-1800s, imported dye was common, and with it came attempts at standardization. European traders encouraged labeled color samples, measurements, and even early attempts at printed catalogs. But these mechanical efforts often fell flat. A printed blue in a ledger looked nothing like the depth of a fabric that had been dyed. Dried, buried in clay, aired for days, then redipped by a weaver guided more by moonlight than mathematics. And so, the disagreements continued, but they shifted. Where once the debate was between weavers about technique, it now became cultural. Between old ways and new imports, between cloth with a story and cloth with a barcode. Many communities split the difference. They used imported dyes for casual wear, but saved traditional indigo for life events, births, weddings, funerals, the transitions that stitched meaning into the everyday. In modern West Africa today, echoes of these shade disputes remain. Artisans in Nigeria's Yoruba regions, for example, still use centuries-old dye pits. In Mali, cloth is still dipped in layers, inspected for tone under shaded light, and described in terms that blend memory and metaphor. Early rain. Black wind, grandmother's evening. Walk into a boutique in Dakar or a market in Bamako, and you may still hear two weavers quietly debating a bolt's tone, not in anger, but with the reverence of artists. One may hold the cloth to her cheek, the other to the shadowed wall. They may disagree, and yet both know the cloth speaks, and so the argument continues not as conflict, but as tradition, because sometimes history is not written in ink, but in the softened edge of a faded seam. Not spoken in decrees, but in the silent tilt of a head inspecting a swatch. Not resolved in grand battles, but in the patient re-dyeing of cloth until the blue matches memory. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the West African indigo. Dispute, a world where the smallest differences still matter, and where even a quiet disagreement over shade becomes a lifelong conversation between craft, color, and the people who carry it forward. And that brings us to the end of tonight's quiet little thread through time. If your eyes are heavier now than when we started, or if your thoughts wandered gently alongside shades of indigo and the careful hands that dyed them, then this story has done its work here on Quite Boring Sleep. We believe that even the most ordinary details, muddy cloth, forgotten gilds, or a sigh over mismatched fabric hold quiet meaning. If you enjoyed this slow drift through history, I'd be honored if you'd give this video a gentle like, or click subscribe to join me for more sleepy stories from the overlooked corners of the past. Until next time, may your dreams be just a little bit dusty, and just boring enough. Good night.